They found it where the jungle had tried to swallow it whole, a tangle of aluminum and vines at the edge of a swampy clearing that still smelled faintly of burned oil after tropical rains. The paint had peeled to an anonymous chalk, but the shape was unmistakable once the crew cleared away the creepers. A squat fighter with a long, clean nose and a cockpit set forward like a spear point. The men said the Americans called it the Airacobra. The senior engineer did not care about the nickname. He cared about the nose. He ran a hand along the spinner, tapped the blank circle at its center, and said the single word that made every tech lean closer. Cannon. To understand the machine in front of them, he began in the only sensible place what the thing actually was, stripped of rumor and spectacle. It was a single-engine fighter designed by Bell, but not in the usual mold. Instead of a big radial up front or an inline that forced guns into wings, the Airacobra moved its Allison engine behind the pilot's seat, drove the propeller with a long shaft that ran beneath the cockpit, and cleared the entire nose for armament and instruments. That freed the designers to build the airplane around a centerpiece. A 37mm autocannon bolted on the centerline and firing straight out through the propeller hub. The layout looked audacious in drawings. Up close, it was audacious in metal. There was no lash, up of wing guns converging at some distance, and no compromise forced by a spinner crowded with reduction gears. The barrel sat perfectly on axis, a steel spine with an airplane wrapped around it. When the crew pried off the spinner, the idea revealed itself in full. The muzzle was there like a pupil staring outward, and behind it the breech and feed ran back on rails that were more gun mount than airframe bracket. The cannon was the M4, a gas-operated weapon with a pace that sounded lazy on paper, roughly 2 to 3 shots per second, but a punch that no machine gun could match. An armor-piercing shot from this bore could chew through light plating or smash radiator cores and spars. A high-explosive round could detonate inside a bomber's wing and turn fuel and aluminum into a single blossoming wound. It was not the kind of weapon one fired indiscriminately. It was a scalpel in a world accustomed to knives. Everything else on the airplane made sense once that premise was accepted. The pilot sat forward for visibility in low-altitude fights, and to keep the center of gravity within reason as the ammunition drum emptied. The nose gear avoided the awkward nose-down stance of tail draggers and kept the airplane level so the mechanics could load the drum at a comfortable height. The long shaft, usually a complexity not worth embracing, became a virtue because it let the gun own the centerline without argument. Even the doors that opened like a car's on either side of the cockpit, a quirk that seemed almost playful on a warplane, made practical sense when a pilot had to scramble in or out on rough jungle strips where a sliding canopy might jam. The senior engineer stepped back and pictured how the Americans had intended this machine to be used, not as a high-altitude sentinel picking fights at 30,000 feet, where superchargers and oxygen systems ruled the day. The Airacobra lived closer to the ground, trading climb and ceiling for presence and punch, where ground fire licked the sky and engagements turned on who could point first and hold steady for a heartbeat. It explained why the Soviets, fighting tooth to tooth over forests, cities and rivers, had flown these with a confidence some Western pilots never felt. It explained why island campaigns dotted with short, muddy runways had seen these machines clawing in and out between hills and clouds. Everything about the airframe, its distribution of mass, its cockpit visibility, its emphasis on the nose declared that the designer wanted a gun platform that could meet a target, face on, and end the conversation quickly. They inventoried what the jungle had not ruined. Instruments had clouded but were legible. The radio set had drowned long ago. The cannon's barrel was serviceable with pitting near the muzzle but no bulges. The drum, a shallow, toroidal magazine of roughly 30 rounds, had corroded on the outside yet still turned by hand with the smooth click of pawls that had been well oiled in another life. The feed path was simple in concept, direct and stubborn in its insistence that all tolerances be exact. Everyone who had ever loved a machine recognized the character immediately. A device that would be magnificent when adjusted and infuriating when anything wandered out of spec. In a shop with gauges and time, it promised order. In a forward-line shack with grit in the grease, it promised jams. The day's light failed, and the clearing hummed with insects, but the men lingered. You do not often meet a weapon that tells you so much about its doctrine in a single glance. The engineer imagined a pilot rolling into the run on a bomber, feeling the airplane steady in his hand because the recoil ran along the center line and did not twist him off target, hearing not the hammering drumroll of rifle-caliber guns but the measured, cannonade cadence of shots that had to count. He imagined a mechanic swearing at ammunition belts that had to be perfectly smooth and drums that had to be loaded as if the next 10 seconds of some pilot's life depended on whether the spring took a set. He imagined the quiet pride of a designer who had convinced a factory to build an airplane not despite a cannon, but for it. When they finally winched the wreck onto skids and began the slow drag out to the coastal road, the engineer walked last. The jungle closed behind them. In the distance, surf beat the reef in the steady rhythm every islander could judge time by. He noted how the air cooled as the sky went navy blue and weighed the risks and rewards that Americans had accepted. Too few rounds, but each round a promise. Modest rate of fire, but a gun that sat where every sightline wanted it to sit. Demanding maintenance, but a layout that made aiming simpler and recoil honest. If you were building a fighter not to dance above the clouds, but to end fights quickly in the weather and heat near the earth, you could do much worse than start with a hole drilled through the spinner and ask the rest of the design to serve it. He had begun the day with skepticism. An airplane that put the engine behind the pilot and a cannon through the propeller sounded like bravado drawn on a napkin. He ended the day with respect. Whatever else would be said about the Airacobra, and he knew pilots everywhere argued about machines as if they were people, the nose told a clean, hard truth. Design is doctrine made metal. The men who built this one had the honesty to show their doctrine on the center line. The clearing became a logistics problem the moment the first tools touched metal. Salvage is not romance. Salvage is rope, sweat, and the will to turn debris into data. The team lashed bamboo poles into a cradle, slid corrugated sheets under the skids to keep them from sinking, and called in the mule train of men who knew every root and stone between the battlefield and the beach. It took 2 days to drag the fuselage to the road, and another 3 to reach a cove where a coastal tug waited, blacked out at night and hidden by palms in daylight. The wreck rode low under tarpaulins that turned stiff with salt. If you had stood on the pier at dawn, you would have seen only an anonymous cargo, not the newest obsession of a technical branch that measured progress in millimeters and foot-pounds. The rhythm that followed was as familiar to the engineers as their own handwriting. Field recovery crews stripped what they could safely remove. Guns, instruments, a propeller, sections of the skin where manufacturing methods could be read from rivet pitch and alloy choice, a seat with its armor plate, fragments of landing gear that revealed shock strut geometry. Each item received a tag that recorded where it had been found, what the condition was, and who had handled it. Photographs froze the state of the wreck before cutting torches changed it. Pencil rubbings captured stampings and inspection marks. A shorthand developed because it had to. Even in war, precision saves time. From the cove to the nearest depot was a voyage measured in nervous hours. Everyone knew what happened to shipping that ventured out in daylight where an enemy patrol plane could find it. Night, therefore, was their friend, and night made every transfer slower. But the crates reached the depot, and the depot sent its manifest to the laboratory up north where benches, hoists, and patient men waited beneath swiveling lamps. A battered propeller hub might pass through 3 departments before the first coffee cooled. Machining to understand tolerances and surface finish, materials to spark and scratch the metal, documentation to map any foreign marks, and armament to pass how the gun mount worked with vibration, recoil, and the sine wave of an engine's power pulses. The lab that received the Airacobra's cannon had already seen the lives other weapons lived. They had measured British and American machine guns, puzzled over Hispano feed problems, traced the evolution of muzzle brakes by comparing notebooks and scars. Yet this one brought a different mood to the bench, because it announced itself as the reason for the airplane rather than a passenger aboard it. They set the breech on blocks, cleaned the barrel with patience, and found the threads where the flash hider had once Saturday They traced the feed from drum to mouth and counted pawls and detents, marking where a burr could start a cascade of misfeeds. When they spun the drum and felt the even pressure of its spring, someone whistled reflexively at the craft. A fighting force is a dialogue between designers and maintainers, and here the designers had given maintainers something beautiful, demanding, and fair. It would do its part if they did theirs. The report began to write itself in careful, understated sentences as data filled the forms. The airplane's timeline slotted into the larger war like a gear finding its mate. Before the conflict, the design had taken shape in the way good ideas often do, too radical for consensus at first, then irresistible when a staff officer imagined the right mission profile. Early production had shown strengths and the usual heartbreak of new machines. The Pacific War, with its wild geography and improvised airfields, had become the arena where the Airacobra either proved itself or revealed its limitations. The lab wrote that sequence without judgment. Their job was not to praise or condemn. Their job was to understand. They also knew that understanding depended on more than parts. So they went back to the men who had fetched the wreck for narrative and nuance. Where had the pilot come down? How long had the airplane burned? What had the locals scavenged, and what had been left for the team? Were there signs of haste in maintenance, visible in rounded fasteners or tool marks? They sketched the line between supply and failure, because army and industry alike needed that line to be short. If a feed jammed after 10 rounds in a fight where the pilot had no second chance to coax it back to life, the reason could not be a mystery. Either the design tolerated rough handling, or it required an ecosystem of care. Either way, the report would say so. Around the lab's work moved other currents. Intelligence officers asked whether the cannon made this airplane a special threat to shipping or heavy bombers. Pilots wanted to know if their tactics should change, whether head-on passes were now more dangerous, whether a target that shrugged at rifle-caliber hits would suddenly belch smoke at the touch of a few explosive shells. Procurement officials, always attuned to the give and take between quantity and quality, wanted to know whether the Americans had made a brave bet or a reckless one by centering a fighter on such a weapon. This is what technology does in war. It pries, questions open. A single barrel emerging from a spinner could change the sequence of decisions hundreds of miles away. As the narrative grew, the lab's tone changed almost imperceptibly from fascination to respect. They had started with the instinct every engineer has when meeting a bold design, poke at it until it flinches, and discovered instead a system that refused to be swatted into simplicity. The mid-engine layout, the long drive shaft, the car-style doors, even the tricycle gear, each peculiarity that veterans enjoyed mocking at airfields, made a different kind of sense on the bench. You could see how ground crews would love some of it and loathe the rest, and you could see how a pilot who learned the airplane's rhythms would become terrifyingly effective in the right envelope. By the time the report's first draft crossed the director's desk, the Airacobra was no longer a wreck dragged from a jungle. It had become a set of numbers, tolerances, and diagrams he could stack next to any domestic project and say, without emotion, how it differed. He could point to the strengths: a centerline weapon that simplified aiming, a recoil path that did not twist the nose off target, a cockpit that gave low-altitude visibility pilots crave when the world is a smear of green and grey. He could point to the weaknesses: an ammunition supply that turned every trigger press into a wager, a rate of fire that punished sloppy lead, a maintenance burden that would not forgive bad grease or inattentive assembly. He could hand the paper to a colonel and a machinist, and know both would understand what mattered. It is easy to think that shock belongs to spectacular, cinematic moments: a new airplane streaking overhead, a weapon cracking the sky with its first shot. But there is another kind of shock that lives in the quiet of workshops, the moment when a foreign design you wanted to dismiss instead looks you in the eye and says it was made for its fight, and made perfectly. The Airacobra was that kind of shock. It arrived in the lab as salvage. It left as a challenge, written in neat characters and margins penciled with questions that would take months to answer. The first time they put the cannon on the test stand and locked the breech, The room carried that particular hush that men recognize when math is about to become noise. The barrel had been cleaned, gauged and ink-tested for cracks. The drum had been stripped and rebuilt, with fresh springs cut to match the original's rate as closely as the shop could manage. Dummy rounds cycled cleanly. The breech ran on its rails like a drawer that someone had planed until wood and hand learned each other. The power unit that would drive the propeller during stand firing sat out of the way, its shaft clamped and indexed, but the illusion was complete. The cannon looked through the spinner's centerline at a painted square on a sandbag wall, as it would in the nose of a living airplane staring across a span of air at an enemy's breastbone. What followed was not theatre so much as calibration. They measured the weight of each round and logged it. They measured the gloss and thickness of lacquer on cartridges, knowing that finish friction could be the difference between a smooth feed and a stoppage. They measured spring rates, and the impulse needed to start and sustain drum rotation. The lab's lead armourer, a man who had spent more of his life with his hands in weapons than on paper, watched the feed path the way a conductor studies the cellos. He touched the drum's rim with a fingertip and nodded when the resistance felt even. He ran a brass brush across the feed mouth and shook his head at a scratch that would take a polish and a breath of oil to forgive. The first live firing was deliberately gentle. Single shot. The weapon's voice was deep and unhurried, the kind that rolls in your chest and leaves a taste of propellant as faint as a struck match. The stand shuddered, then settled. A rag fell from a shelf. Someone exhaled and only then realized he had been holding that air in his lungs. The barrel's axis returned true almost by itself, because the recoil came straight back into the stand instead of twisting everything offline. A wing gun, even a perfectly built one, always drummed you sideways a little. This did not. The men made noises that meant everything and nothing. Approval, surprise, relief. Now they could begin to read the weapon as an engineer reads a new colleague's handwriting. Rate of fire stabilized at a beat that would sound slow to anyone raised on the chatter of lighter guns. Roughly 2.5 strokes every second. The muzzle velocity lived in the band the books promised, enough to flatten the trajectory at the ranges a disciplined pilot would choose for a head-on or stern pass. The group on the sandbag wall told a truth few armchair debates ever accept. Systems matter. A centerline mount with recoil in line will make an average pilot better sooner because it lets him see and correct without fighting the airplane's own asymmetries. No convergence to calculate. No hoping that two streams of wing-mounted fire would meet in a space that moved as both pilot and target jinked. The sight picture became what gunnery should always be a problem, in timing and lead, not geometry layered on luck. Then came the part that separates shop curiosity from war work. They dirtied their hands, deliberately. They lightly nicked a cartridge rim to mimic rough handling. They eased spring tension 2% below the sweet spot. They ran a feed that was almost clean, but not quite. They let a light smear of graphite take the place of perfect oil, and the cannon told them its character in a harder voice. It would run, but not forever, and when it stopped it did so with a stubbornness that made everyone look down the line into the airplane that would one day carry it. A jam at altitude is not a shop problem. It is a human problem for a pilot suddenly holding a machine that is now only partly the weapon he intended to bring to a fight. The team logged the stoppage with the sobriety it deserved. They did not condemn the design. They did, however, underline the sentence that mattered. This installation demands exactitude. The reward for that exactitude is aim that never lies to you. If the weapon framed the conversation, the ammunition gave it depth. The high-explosive shell promised drama against structures and fuel. The armor-piercing shot quiet competence against engines and lightly protected parts. Nobody spoke about tanks. That was not the point, and anyone who tried to force the cannon into that role would be arguing with physics for the sake of a headline. Here the discussion returned to what aerial fighting actually is for crews who live, where clouds scrape ridgelines. The men drew a yard-long sketch of an intercept, boxed the moment when sights pass over a bomber's wing route, and circled the fraction of a second a pilot has to make the shot count. At that scale, a modest magazine that feeds perfectly and puts a handful of shells exactly where sight and hand agree is not a handicap. It is a philosophy. A pilot trained for it will not spray. He will wait for the right picture and then unlock a door with one key, not rattle at a lock with a fistful of wrong ones. In the bench notes, a peculiar intimacy developed between the engineers and a machine conceived oceans away. They admired the restraint that had kept the nose clean of compromises. They admired the way the mount used rails rather than clever, fragile cages. They liked very much how the breech could be drawn back far enough for serious maintenance without unduly dismantling the airplane. And they noticed what any experienced crew chief would notice after 3 months in the field: the places where rushed hands and gritty air would pick fights with a device that demanded respect. Instruction sheets almost wrote themselves. Keep feed lips smooth. Keep tension within this narrow band. Keep the drum loaded with the care of a watchmaker winding a spring he intends to hand to his grandson. If a reader expected the report to crescendo into fireworks, he would have been disappointed. The shock the team recorded was steadier and more professional. They had not expected to find a foreign weapon that aligned so cleanly with a specific, coherent doctrine. They saw in that alignment a mirror held up to their own projects, asking whether each domestic airplane wore its purpose on its centerline or hid it in a compromise. There is something bracing about that kind of confrontation because it leaves no room to hide behind adjectives. Either your design prints its intent in every rivet line, or it is a polite committee sketch that will try to be many things and excel at none. By the time the stand trials concluded, the cannon had stopped being a curiosity and become a teacher. Not an idle, no engineer with self-respect bows to another man's blueprint, but a teacher that showed how clarity in weapons thinking begets clarity in metal. The notebook margins held more than tolerances. They held reflections phrased in the dry language of laboratories but felt in the gut. Centerline truth beats wing, mounted noise, recoil honesty beats convenience, discipline in the trigger beats the false comfort of bottomless belts. If you took those lines and erased the proper nouns, they could guide any program that hoped to build something worthy. They shut off the lights over the stand that night one by one, the way men do when they want to linger without admitting it. The room smelled of oil, old paper, and a sweetness almost like almond from the propellant. Outside, somewhere beyond the blacked-out windows, a war kept its own pace. Inside, the work had slowed time down to a tempo that made sense. Understand, measure, write, and only then judge. The Airacobra taught 2 lessons at once, and within the laboratory they braided together so tightly that separating them felt unnatural. One was geometric, written in sight pictures and trajectories. The other was institutional, written in signatures and seals. You cannot send a weapon to war unless both lessons pass. The geometric lesson began with the sketch every gunnery teacher draws on a chalkboard. 2 aircraft converging, their paths slipping through time more than through space, because what matters is not where they are, but where they will be a sliver of a moment from now. In that sketch, a centerline cannon reduces the variables. A pilot leans his sight on the place where his mind calculates future and present, will overlap, and does not have to fight the twist of recoil or the vagaries of convergence. He is still accountable for judgment altitude, closure, angle off, the willingness to ease the trigger rather than clench it, but the airplane conspires to help him rather than fight him. Against a bomber, the sums become even kinder. Fewer shells are needed when one delivers a fist rather than a finger jab, and the recoil returns the gun to true rather than lying about where the next shot will go. Opposite that chalkboard stands the tradition that had shaped so many domestic airframes: multiple rifle-caliber guns bracketing a nose, later paired with light cannon that traded impact for higher cadence. That tradition had its own fierce logic. It filled the air with metal and let average pilots hurt average opponents through volume and probability. It was not wrong, and in the right sky it was wise. But the Airacobra demanded an acknowledgement that there are environments where probability yields to precision. Low-altitude islands and river plains punish spray, clouds, and hills compress fights into windows the size of a hangar door. In such places, A measured handful of shells sent exactly where a sight points may be more honest than a glorious storm of tracers that looks heroic and achieves little. Once the geometry had been accepted, not adored, not adopted without critique, simply understood, the second lesson became urgent. Who exactly decides what to do with what the lab has learned? In a neat building a train ride away, a directorate held that authority, and its process was as formal as any civil code. The lab drafted a report with appendices that did not flatter impatience: measured drawings, materials analyses, feed studies, recoil figures, and the notoriously unglamorous lubrication tables. The report moved to a board where officers who had smelled burned oil in cockpits sat beside officers who had read doctrines in quiet rooms. These men did not vote on beauty. They asked whether the evidence supported a change in tactics, a procurement pivot, or a technical experiment that could steal a virtue from a foreign design without importing a vice. The board sent queries back down the chain the way a craftsman sends a piece back to an apprentice, with specific marks in red pencil. Could the centerline truth be captured in a domestic mount without opening an abyss of new maintenance burdens? Could a larger bore, low rate of fire gun be fed with something more forgiving than a drum, perhaps a belt whose temperament did not spiral when one tooth chipped? Could sights be adapted to give a pilot permission to wait for the exact picture this kind of weapon rewards? None of these questions had the theater of a demonstration flight, but all of them had the gravity of institutions making choices they would later have to defend. Alongside the board's work ran the quiet influence of the men whose toolboxes were as much a part of their identity as their uniforms. Crew chiefs leaned over the bench and told the lab what it meant to care for something exacting in a war that often asked men to fix airplanes in mud with one light and a wrench missing a jaw. They were not cynical. They were guardians of what could actually be done on a strip pinned between sea and forest. When they read the sentences about tolerances and spring tensions, they nodded or frowned and wrote in the margins the words that mattered most: sustainable or not. And then there were the pilots, the end of the chain and the beginning of the story. They read nothing at first. They listened. Their squadrons had scraps of rumor about this foreign nose gun, stories that made it sound like a thunderbolt or a dud depending on who was talking and whether the story's teller had a scar to prove his point. The lab invited them to see the stand, and the sandbag wall pierced in precise, discouragingly small clusters. No one was promised miracles. Instead, they were promised a different contract. If you can keep your hands steady and your nerve cool for a breath longer than fear urges, this gun will reward you with a result that 50 rifle-caliber bullets could not guarantee. You cannot fight every duel this way, but when the geometry is yours, this machine will keep its word. The board's verdict did not thunder. It arrived, stamped and signed, as serious decisions ought to, and it did not try to pretend that a single foreign machine could overturn a doctrine shaped by factories, training pipelines, and the realities of supply. What it did was acknowledge the shock that had prompted the research, the honest surprise of meeting a design that embodied its purpose with admirable clarity and authorized specific trials. Mounts would be studied, centerline options would be sketched, sights would be examined with new assumptions baked into the reticle and the training talk that accompanied it. Above all, tactics would be tuned not with slogans but with geometry. If a squadron faced a foe who brought such a gun to the head-on pass, the squadron would learn when to avoid that geometry and when to own it so completely the foe's advantage dissolved. Months later, when copies of the Airacobra report lay on shelves with dog-eared pages and oily thumbprints, the engineers could stand back and see what had changed. They had not imported another nation's soul. They had, however, imported a question that would not stop asking itself inside meeting rooms and hangars alike. Are we building to our fight with the same honesty they built to theirs? A weapon in a spinner had forced the question better than any lecture could. If a factory man wanted proof that clarity of purpose mattered more than rhetoric about versatility, he could walk to the stand, tap the breech that still sat on its rails for teaching, and hear again the measured voice of a cannon that had never tried to be anything but what it was. Out on an airstrip where the wind tasted of salt and gasoline, a young pilot climbed into a domestic fighter whose guns remained as they had been weeks before. He strapped in, ran checks, and felt the machine settle into the run like a dog into a familiar path. None of the hardware had changed because of the report on a foreign gun. Yet when he rolled in on a target drone and watched the sight slide across its course, he waited a heartbeat longer, eased the trigger rather than slapped it, and let the streams meet where his mind said future and present would briefly kiss. Somebody had told him a story about a cannon in a spinner, and though his own airplane had no such thing, the story had taught him something he could use. That is how shock leaves the laboratory and enters the world not as a borrowed machine, but as a sharpened habit of thought that makes even old metal fly a little truer. The argument lived in the drum. Every design choice this airplane made, moving the engine behind the pilot, carrying the propeller on a shaft that hummed under the floorboards, clearing the nose of machinery, had been a lawyer's brief, so the drum could sit where it needed to sit and present its rounds at the proper height and angle. Engineers admire audacity when it is honest, and there is nothing more honest than carving an airframe around a circle of ammunition. They lifted the toroidal magazine onto a padded block as carefully as if it were porcelain, not because it was fragile, but because respect is a habit that keeps hands from growing sloppy. The drum's skin had corroded like anything that spends months breathing salt and rain, yet inside, the heart still beat. Springs that bore their work with the resilience of tempered music wire, followers that rode their tracks as if they remembered yesterday's factory oil, pawls that clicked with the sound of a lock settling. A weapon speaks most plainly in how it eats. Belt-fed guns forgive a little mischief. They will chew past a mildly scarred rim, digest a cartridge that glints a shade too dull, shrug off a momentary stutter when a loader's attention wanders. Drums are less tolerant because they promise something belts cannot. A gentle, steady presentation of rounds at a perfect height, handed off to the feed lips like a baton passed during a race where one stumble ends the day. The Airacobra's drum did not play at being universal or clever. It did one job, beautifully, and demanded to be kept in the narrow corridor where tolerances and lubrication made that beauty inevitable. The lab began with the ritual any good armourer knows by feel, even when the lights are out. They stripped the drum, washed each part in solvent that carried away the jungle's ghost, measured spring rates against what the manuals would have promised, and rebuilt it with a care that turned a circle of steel and a handful of small parts into a promise. Then they rehearsed the feed like musicians tone their instruments. Turn 2 degrees. Stop. Present the rim. Let the follower settle. Touch the tension. Close your eyes and listen. A man who has built bicycles can tell you when a bearing is right by the note it plays. A man who has lived inside guns can tell you when a drum is honest by the weight it returns to his hand as he turns it. Only when the ritual had been performed to satisfaction did the ammunition enter the scene, and with it the reality that no weapon exists apart from its food. They weighed cartridges on a scale that had judged everything from rifle loads to shell fuses. They examined lacquer for thickness and uniformity, because a varnish that is a kiss too heavy can change the friction in a feed path enough to start a rumour and end a sortie. They rejected rounds by the simplest standard. If a fingertip caught on a microscopic burr at the rim, it didn't go in. It is tedious work, and therefore the only kind worth doing before you hand a machine to a pilot who will ask it to argue for his life. The irony at the heart of the Airacobra's nose made the team smile without humour. The entire concept gave the pilot something generous, a sight picture that told the truth, recoil that came straight back and let him correct cleanly, a weapon whose few shells promised more than a storm of small-caliber fire. In return, the airplane asked the ground crew to be saints, not in the romantic sense of martyrdom, but in the everyday sense of faithfulness. Keep the feed lips polished until the metal reflects your face. Keep spring tension, where the notebook says it must live not by memory, not by about there, but where the gauge says, to the hair. Keep dust out, even on days when dust is the weather, and keep oil in without letting oil become a varnish that will glue the gun still the first time propellant reaches it. They performed the most important test any weapon must face: indifference. Not sabotage, not abuse, mere human indifference, the kind that creeps in when a man has worked the night shift twice in a row and the rain made his tools clumsy and his breath taste like tin. They loaded rounds with hands kept clean but not immaculate. They left a trace of grit where a perfectionist would have wiped a third time. They drew the spring down to the edge of acceptability and no more. And then they watched the drum make its argument. For a while it ran with the tender obstinacy of good machinery that wants to keep its end of the bargain. Then a hesitation lengthened. The feed paused as if gathering its thoughts. The armourer reached toward the mount the way a father reaches toward a child who is about to stumble in a crowd. A gesture, half warning, half promise. The gun spoke once more, then held its tongue. Not a catastrophic failure, not a shattered part. Merely a stoppage that would be a footnote in a lab and a sentence in a pilot's diary that ended with the word luck. If the report had been written by romantics, it would have cursed the drum as too fussy for war. The report was written by professionals, and therefore it recorded the demand and weighed it against the returns. A head-on pass against a bomber does not present itself every minute. When it does, the right machine in the right hands can turn a battle, a convoy attack, a city's dawn. If the cost is to order your habits around a drum's happiness, perhaps that is not arrogance on the designer's part, but discipline asked of a team that wants the rewards of precision without paying its price. Courage needs partners, and sometimes the partner is a checklist executed as if liturgy. On a sun-washed strip, where men wiped sweat from their eyebrows with the back of a hand that was never quite clean, ground crews learned this airplane's truth faster than any board could legislate it. The senior mechanic divided his men without drama into two camps, those who would master the drum and those who would master everything else. He did not mean that as a slight. He meant it as doctrine. "We are not building a myth here," he told them. "We are building a practice. If you own the feed path and the spring as if your name had been stamped on them at the factory, you will give the pilot back a weapon that is faithful. If you dabble, you will deliver to the sky a question mark. It is a small thing to stand on a ladder with oil and rags and a spring gauge, but wars turn on such small things when larger ones split evenly. A day came when the drum was loaded perfectly, and the pilot had the geometry of a pass that textbooks draw on boards and weather rarely allows. He did not spray. He did not ask the gun to do more than it had been designed to do. He placed the sight on the seam where wing meets nacelle, waited the half-breath that feels like cowardice until you practice it, and then pressed. The barrel returned true as if on a hinge built by a stubborn god. He did not count the shots. He did not need to. Fire blossomed from a place where aluminum prefers not to burn. He flew through his own future and into clean air, and did not look back until the world behind him was a fact and not a hope. That evening the drum sat open on a table under a hanging lamp, a humble relic of a moment the pilot's memory would embroider for the rest of his life. The engineer ran a cloth along the feed lips, and felt the smoothness a proud craftsman cannot help but check again and again. The argument inside the drum had been settled, at least for that day. Weapons that pretend to be easy will betray you when the world grows hard. Weapons that demand you shape yourself to them will, on certain days, repay the favor with an honesty that justifies the discipline. The Airacobra never pretended. The men around it learned to stop pretending too. The clouds in that theater did not float. They leaned. They slouched against ridgelines and draped valleys with a bleached muslin that pilots learned to read the way farmers read winds. A man who grew up in these latitudes could look at the sky an hour after dawn and tell you what kind of day the air intended to be. On this morning it intended to be a clerk fussy, exacting, hawk-eyed shuffling papers of weather that would give and then snatch back visibility without warning. The patrol lifted into that clerk's world with the resigned competence of men who understood they would not be granted a fair fight unless they made it. The Airacobra did not complain. It settled into the low sky as a cat settles into grass. Mist brushed the canopy. The engine behind the pilot was a presence rather than a companion, a hum felt in spine more than heard in ears. The pilot watched the horizon collapse into slopes that folded into each other like the pleats of a curtain. He knew this country the way a gambler knows the room he has spent too many nights in. Which corner will break your concentration, which table yields to patience, where the dealer's tell lives. Out here, the tells were trees whose tops bent the wrong way, where a sea breeze funneled, river bends that gleamed like the whites of startled eyes, a thread of dust that meant someone far below was moving in a hurry and would soon need to explain himself to someone with a notebook. They met the enemy as one meets a storm you smelled before dawn. A light scattered formation, born of the same weather and the same necessities, stepping across an invisible line on a map that existed only in a clerk's drawer in a city 1,000 miles away. You cannot describe such meetings in the grand terms histories love because they are not grand. They are intimate, quick, and violent, not because anyone wants them to be, but because the sky gives you a window the size of a hangar door and says, politely, now. 2 fighters slid toward the patrol's left. The leader did not call a play. He did not have time to preach about doctrine. He said a word that meant what it needed to mean left, and the patrol bent as if a thread had tugged their noses. The Airacobra's pilot saw what mattered most, the angle that would, if he did not spoil it, become the kind of head-on pass that textbooks persistently draw as if the world didn't tremble. He did not hurry. Hurrying is how men turn geometry into confusion. He let the picture ripen. He felt his right foot tip forward and caught himself, because nerves like to climb rudder pedals the way children climb chairs when adults aren't watching. He watched the sight, and his hands learned again the lesson the cannon had taught on the stand. You are not painting a canvas. You are threading a needle. He pressed when the picture was a held breath. The weapon spoke with its measured authority, and the Airacobra did what honest recoil demands. It shrugged backward and returned its nose to truth. The first shell vanishes in any narrative because the mind cannot hold both the act and the consequence at once. The second often writes the memory. He would remember a dull flash where a wing meets a life, a smear of something too bright for that sky, and then he would not remember anything for a heartbeat because human minds are not built to log every pixel of a life and death argument. He crossed the pass tidy, no wrench at the stick, and let the enemy's silhouette slide left as the geometry dissolved and the fight returned to its native chaos. To his right, someone made a mistake and paid for it. Mistakes in low skies are expensive because there is so little altitude to mortgage. You cannot borrow air from angels when the ground is close enough to choose your epitaph. The patrol's second pair dipped to cover, flung themselves into the kind of knife fight that looks thrilling in posters and feels like drowning in a washing basin when you are living it. The Airacobra's pilot checked his sightline, no target offered itself, checked his 6, and discovered the truest sentence gunnery instructors ever pass on. The next picture worth shooting at is not the one you want, it is the one that appears. You do not bend the sky to your doctrine. You bend your doctrine to the sky. When the fight broke apart, as fights do when fuel and nerves conspire to call for an intermission, the patrol climbed to a place where the world regained its dimensions. The pilot looked down at the small, precise fires that mark a morning's work, and thought again about the difference one weapon makes when the rest is a dead heat. He did not imagine that he had flown better than the man whose silhouette had lately filled his sight. He imagined instead that machines are arguments turned to metal, and that his argument had needed fewer words. Later, on the ground where everything still smells of heat and oil even after the sun goes home, he found the ground chief standing in the shade of a wing as if it were a roof staked into the day. The drum sat on a trolley with its mouth shut and its secrets kept. The pilot did not give a lecture. He did not wave his hands in a pantomime of the past that had changed a morning. He touched the drum with the kind of casualness men use when they are not casual at all. The chief did not smile. He had the resting face of a judge. He nodded once at the way one nods to a man at the end of a long sentence that had to be said, and then repeated, "We'll keep it that way." The geometry lives in the head. The mathematics live in the hands. The Airacobra had a way of forcing the two to agree. It would never convince men who loved the high, cold wars that this low, sweaty work was noble. It did not have to. It had modelled a kind of fight that the climate and the hills dictated, and when machines accept the dominion of their environment rather than pretending to transcend it, they prosper in proportion to their honesty. A centerline cannon is not a magic trick. It is a world view. On days when the world gives you 10 seconds of clean angle and the nerve to wait for the one that counts, it is enough. By the time the report had made 3 loops through the offices that decide how a nation spends its genius, the arguments had congealed into shapes you could pick up and turn in your hands. The Airacobra whispered a seductive invitation. Put your faith in the centerline, give the pilot truth instead of noise, and trust discipline more than volume. It was not in the character of a proud industry to accept any invitation without testing every floorboard, and so the engineers drew alternatives and daringly dull diagrams with equal seriousness. The first alternative was doctrinal inertia in its best form, do nothing rash. Rifle-caliber belts were cheap, reliable, friendly to muddy hands. Light cannon added a bark and a bite without asking the earth to pause while armourers fussed over spring rates. Pilots understood the language of a battery that sprayed a convincing essay into the air. The counter-argument wrote itself in the margins. There are fights in which essays persuade no one. If the enemy arrives nose, on with a fist in the spinner, you had better have a reply beyond rhetoric. The second alternative was imitation, that vice which is virtue's shadow. Draw a mount, thread a barrel through a spinner, copy what looks copyable, and hope the appetites of metallurgy, feed geometry, and vibration keep their hunger in check. Even men who disliked the foreign machine rolled paper into cylinders and squinted through them at airframes they knew, trying to see where a barrel might live if one were to be rude enough to invite it. They were not fools. They were brutally honest about the consequences. You do not insert a weapon this heavy and this demanding into a nose without asking the rest of your machine to bow. Balance shifts, airflow sulks, maintenance workloads harden into schedules that will not be charmed. Imitation is cheaper than understanding only on the first Tuesday. By the second, the invoices grow teeth. The third alternative was the engineer's favourite, not because it is romantic, but because it is faithful to how progress actually moves. Steal the principle, not the part. If the virtue here is centerline truth, can that be captured with a lighter, friendlier gun whose diet is belts rather than drums? If the virtue is recoil in line, can mounts be designed so that what the pilot feels through the stick is a straight push and not a twist? If the virtue is the discipline the sight demands, can training change the shape of a pilot's patience even if his trigger releases a chorus rather than a baritone? They built a mock nose on a fixture that is the laboratory's answer to a stage set. Every Air Force keeps such fantasies in back rooms, aluminum skeletons that can be rearranged with the same guilty pleasure children find in erector sets. On this skeleton they mounted ballast equal to a heavy cannon's weight, and then hung a lighter gun in the position where a spinner would be if one were present. They ran the rig until screws complained, and then ran it longer because screws must learn to serve. They filmed the muzzle with a camera that measured a tremor a pianist would be proud of. And then they modified the mount until tremor became drift, and drift became a return to center that a pilot's hand would not have to fight. When they were satisfied, they wrote a sentence that is the birth certificate of many good ideas. Acceptable. Acceptable is a harder word to win than excellent, because it cannot be bought with dazzle. It is earned by 100 indignities. A field unit will inflict without malice wrenches with teeth missing, days when the only cloth to hand has grit in it, nights when a man will tighten a nut with the first 2 fingers of a hand that has forgotten it was wounded a month ago. Acceptable means a virtue will survive indifference and return value even when the romance has gone out of the room. The board listened to the alternatives without theatrics. The chairman had flown when he was younger. He had also waited for parts when he was older. He had the look of a man who believed in miracles because he had seen a few, and distrusted them because he had seen how the bill is presented later. He said what such men say when they are trying to keep everyone honest. Show me. Commit the mock nose to paper and numbers. Find a domestic gun whose temperament is civil. Sketch the training changes in a way that a squadron's day can swallow without choking. We will not go broke chasing a foreign silhouette. We will not grow stubborn and refuse instruction either. In the weapon shops, the atmosphere was friendlier than you might think. Pride does not always wear a frown. A master machinist can admire a foreign part as he admires a rival's dovetail joint. Not because he wants to live in that man's house, but because competence likes company. They made small bets. One team polished a belt feed until it sang, and then mounted it dead center in a test bed to see whether vibration would be a friend or a thief. Another crew built a sight with a reticle that encouraged waiting for the picture a centerline gun loves, even though the airplane that would wear it kept its familiar chorus in the wings. A third tested muzzle brakes and recoil buffers, as if they were tuning a stringed instrument rather than trying to club physics into submission. While metal answered questions with the grudging clarity that metal provides, paper moved as paper must. The doctrine writers began to edit paragraphs they had grown too comfortable with, scratching out words that assumed a storm of bullets was a virtue in all weathers. They did not destroy what had worked. They added footnotes that will, in time, become main text. When the geometry is yours, take the shot as if each round were a gift. When the geometry is not yours, do not flatter yourself with noise. When the enemy brings a centerline truth to a knife fight, do not let him own the angle that makes you a victim. When the angle is yours, do not waste it with impatience. What to copy and what to refuse, this is the adult question in every craft. Children copy because copying is how hands learn shapes. Adults refuse because refusing is how identity survives the temptation to turn into a mirror. The Airacobra had shone a large, polished reflector in the room. The men who built their own machines felt the warmth of that light, and also its glare. They would not be bullied by it, nor would they pretend darkness was virtue. They would, as professionals do, take what they could carry without disfiguring their own work, and leave the rest with a nod that meant respect. Months grind men into shapes their mothers would not recognize. The lab's benches wore a new patina of scratches, where the drum's rim had kissed wood 1,000 times. The sight testing lane had pencil ticks along the wall, where instructors had moved a target card an inch, then another, to demonstrate how patience made a miracle look like method. The pilot's mess kept a joke alive, the only part of war worth memorializing in verse, and the joke was that the fastest mod any unit can adopt is a superstition that actually works. The superstition, in this case, was not a rabbit's foot or a coin taped to an instrument. It was a pause. Wait until the picture is right. Then press. It spread from men who had seen what a measured cannon could do to men who flew airplanes that would never carry one, because a habit of mind moves faster through a squadron than any crate of parts can. You could hear the habit at the range if you knew what you were listening for. It changed the music of practice, where once a burst began as an apology for nerves and trailed off into an embarrassed laugh. Now there was a staccato modesty that meant the shooter had held his breath a fraction longer than vanity prefers. Instructors did not need to sermonize. They hung a silhouette and drew a small square in chalk where wing root meets engine. They said, "We will not measure how much lead you put into the air. We will measure where the first honest round lands." Pilots who had spent a career believing volume was virtue learned another, truth without being asked to renounce the first. That restraint is a kind of courage the body resists until the mind trains it. The ground crews caught the habit too, though no one thanked them with speeches. They made checklists kinder to tired eyes. The drum masters wrote cards their apprentices could keep in a breast pocket and touch when doubts fluttered like birds at dusk. There is a theology to maintenance, quiet and unadorned. It says that fidelity in small work, wiping a feed lip until a cloth squeaks, feeling a spring with the flesh of a thumb rather than the instrument of a gauge, tightening a fastener until it is right, rather than until the wrist grows bored, will one day be argued in the court of the sky and rewarded in the currency pilots understand. If men who carry wrenches cannot believe in that theology, the war has already been lost, and all the maps are lies. The habit leaked into places that were not mechanical. A young officer who had never seen the foreign fighter wrote training notes that cleansed a gunnery syllabus of its worst laziness. He removed words that suggested salvation could be purchased by laying a long, noisy blanket of bullets over a problem. He added diagrams that did not flatter illusions. Arrows that once curved theatrically now met with unromantic exactness. The sight reticle's rings were no longer decorations. They were rulers that told the pilot what the enemy's wingspan meant at a certain distance, and why the moment to shoot is shorter than the moment to wish you had shot. There is a temptation, when a foreign machine leaves the stage, to imagine that its influence fades with the green paint on test stands and the smudged fingerprints on report covers. The truth is less theatrical and more enduring. Influence becomes the posture of a hand. A weapon that taught a staff to center geometry instead of exalting spectacle leaves fingerprints on memos a decade later when a different program asks for money and a different board asks for courage. The cannon in the spinner will be melted into farm tools and cookware by then. The habit will turn up in a classroom where a boy with notebooks instead of epaulets learns that craftsmanship is not decoration but discipline. One evening, in a hangar that smelled of canvas, rubber, and the last of the day's fuel vapors, a pilot sat on a wheel and listened to the story again. The teller was not trying to make it legend. He was trying to keep it true, which is a harder task. He did not make the Airacobra into a miracle or the men who worked on it into saints. He said only that the machine embodied a principle with a clarity that embarrassed those who confuse compromises for wisdom. He said that you could build an airplane like a promise to yourself, and when the moment came to keep it, the machine would support your honesty. The pilot put his hands in his pockets and stared at the floor as if the answer were hidden in the stains. He would fly a different airplane tomorrow, one that spoke a language of plural guns and thick belts, one that argued with the air in a familiar grammar. Yet he knew he would carry a borrowed accent into that language, a trace of the centerline's truth in the way he waited and aimed. If someone had asked him what had changed him, what indeed had rewired nerves that thrill at noise into nerves that respect a pause, he might have said it was a cannon he had never fired. That would not be quite right. It was a way of seeing that cannon forced into focus. Wars end. They end in parades if the world is merciful, in statistics if it is not, in silence if men are tired enough. Shops go quiet. Benches are cleared and burned or saved and passed down to the next generation who will turn peace into its own vocation. The habit does not end. It transposes. The same men who learn to love tolerances for the sake of a pilot's morning will one day fuss over a child's bicycle brakes with comic seriousness. The same patience that turned a pass from hope into certainty will help a craftsman lay a joint no rain will invade. The world will not notice the connection, but a handful of men will, and their faces will soften when their fingers find the old rhythm in a new task. As for the report, it took on the air of a ledger balanced to the satisfaction of a bookkeeper who knows the value of truth. On the last page, the summary refused melodrama. It said that the foreign machine was a consistent answer to a particular problem, that its demands were high but not unreasonable for units prepared to shoulder them, that its virtues were transferable in part and imitable in spirit. It recommended trials not because trials are a way to postpone decisions, but because trials are the only honourable way to let metal argue back. Stamped below, in ink that had bled a little into paper fibres, too cheap to be called archival, the approvals rested like a final word that is not quite the end of a conversation. Some nights a wind out of the east pushed the smell of the sea into the lab's rooms even with the windows shut. The men breathed it without remark. They had grown used to the idea that the border between the bench and the sky is porous, that thoughts carried on paper can ride weather into a cockpit and change the way a man waits for a sight picture. It is a modest, almost invisible miracle, and therefore the only kind engineers trust. The cannon had shocked them once. The habit it left behind did something better. It made shock unnecessary. Stories travel faster than airplanes. By the time a report reaches the men who must fly tomorrow's sortie, it has already been edited by rumour, brightened by memory, and darkened by grief. The Airacobra's nose gun lived in that rumour mill like a lodger who pays late but tells irresistible tales. One pilot swore the shells walked through a bomber as if it were made of paper screens. Another spat that the weapon turned a fight into a gamble with a crooked dealer. The laboratory could indulge neither testimony nor temper. Its task was narrower and therefore braver. Turn echoes back into evidence. They began with ledgers and ended with maps. Sortie logs that recorded ammunition expended, strikes observed, and mechanical faults were aligned against the day's weather and the unit's tasking. Times and altitudes were not mere details, they were the frame in which truth could be hung level. A burst that looked miraculous in a memoir looked merely competent on a chart where geometry had been kind and patience had been trained. A failure that felt like betrayal became a note in a column that read, "Feed stoppage after 12." And that note pointed back to a tolerance, not a superstition. From the ledgers they walked out to the airplanes and listened to steel. Breaches that had been slammed open in anger carried the scars of fingers that could not afford gentleness in the air. Mounts that had been cajoled into alignment showed file marks that made a fitting room of a forward dispersal strip. You could almost read the day a mechanic learned where the mount wanted a whisper rather than a shove. You could almost read the night when someone tried to hurry the drum and the spring remembered the insult at altitude. Evidence is indifferent to pride. It will sit on a page beside a name and refuse to soften because a man has the eyes of the sleep-starved. In the classroom, the reality grew less glamorous and more useful. Instructors took the chalk and drew what shells do when the sight is honest and the hand is late, then drew again what they do when the sight is honest and the hand waits the half-breath that separates luck from craft. The cannon's low cadence stopped being a complaint and became a metronome. Click for discipline. Click for nerve. Click for a result you can write down. That cadence annoyed men who loved fury and reassured the ones who loved closure. Both kinds of men learned, grudgingly, that a machine cannot be argued into a role it was not built for. The Airacobra would never climb to courts where thin air and numbers alone settle disputes. It would decide quarrels where clouds smell like rain and hills stand too close together for bravado. The lab did not publish sermons, it published ratios, ammunition expended to effects achieved, stoppages per 100 engagements. The distance at which the first shell, properly led, produced a change the eye could swear to under oath. The numbers did not crush the romance, they merely fenced it. What remained inside the fence was stronger because it had survived measurement. When a pilot next heard a friend praise the gun as if it were a legend or curse it as if it were a traitor, he had a quieter story to tell, a story with pages and pencil ticks. He could say, not that it always works or that it never does, but that when you serve it with the exactitude it asks and take only the shots that belong to its geometry, it keeps its word at a rate a reasonable man can plan his life around. In war, that is as close to certainty as you will ever be given. Approval does not roar. It initials. The board's signature page travelled back to the laboratories folded once and clipped with a pin that had been straightened and bent so many times it could stand as a diagram for bureaucracy itself. But the words above those initials were alive. They authorized trials, real ones, not parades. The Airacobra had started as salvage and then as spectacle. Now it would complete its arc as teacher, the only retirement an honourable machine deserves. Trials began with small heresies against habit. A domestic fighter flew with a sight reticle that had been redrawn to tempt patience. An armament team slipped a centerline test mount into a nose where nothing heavier than a camera had lived before. The mount did not pretend to be permanent. It asked only to be measured by the same standard the foreign gun had demanded. Tell the truth about recoil. Tell the truth about return to aim. Tell the truth about what a human hand can correct without begging a miracle from physiognomy or fate. Paper moved in concentric circles around these acts. Squadron leaders wrote after-action notes in a prose that kept adjectives on a short leash. Instructors revised syllabi without pretending they had invented the ideas they were borrowing. Depot chiefs petitioned for gauges that measured spring tension in units even a tired corporal could respect at midnight. None of it would have troubled a poet's sleep. All of it would have made that poet grateful if he ever had to fly. There were failures, and they were precious. A promising belt-feed prototype decided that certain vibrations were music to its misbehavior. A recoil buffer that looked elegant in drawings turned surly when summer heat thickened oil into glue. A set of mounting rails amplified harmonics until the muzzle described a lopsided figure eight a mathematician would have been proud to name. Each failure narrowed the path from imitation to understanding. If the foreign machine had asked men to be saints, These trials asked them to be confessors, write down what went wrong without excuse, and absolve it only by making the next part hum where the last one sulked. On the airfields, the paper war arrived in the smallest of reforms. A gun camera's film was now developed before lunch rather than before dinner, because memory is a solvent that erases errors and leaves only legends. A mark appeared on a hangar wall at the exact height where a pilot's eye should meet a target card if the aircraft sat in loading attitude. Crews checked it the way gamblers touch a token before work. An armourer scrawled a vulgar limerick inside the drum's lid that decoded was a mnemonic for the lubrication order no one dared forget. When the board reconvened, no one asked for stirring speeches. The chairman looked older in a kindly way, as men do when they have been told the truth steadily for months. He read the charts and said the only praise that matters: sufficient cause. Do not mortgage doctrine to chase an idol, but do not forbid men from walking the narrower path when the day's geometry rewards it. Train the eye, teach the pause. Where possible, bring recoil into line with sight and sense. Where impossible, at least remove the habits that make a good shot worse. A trial does not end a debate. It teaches both sides how to argue better. When the minutes closed, the signatures at the bottom of the page looked less like authority and more like stewardship. The men understood now that a spinner with a secret had not come to shame them or to convert them, but to sharpen their work. It had succeeded. Any machine that wears a reputation like a cloak will breed catechisms. Some you learn as jokes, others are recited as if they were liturgy. The Airacobra collected them the way a ship collects barnacles, and scraping them off revealed more about the men than about the metal. The first myth insisted that a single heavy shell makes a pilot brave. The truth is meaner and more dignified. A single heavy shell makes a pilot careful. When ammunition is counted in handfuls, the mind edits the sky differently. You stop composing essays with tracers and start writing telegrams. The canonization of courage is easy. The discipline of caution is the real sacrament. The next myth declared that a hub gun turns accuracy into inevitability. It does nothing of the sort. It removes two lies: the twist of recoil that jerks a nose off truth, and the romance of wing convergence that promises more than it can deliver in a moving world and leaves the pilot alone with his mathematics. If a man wants inevitability, let him apply to a different profession. Flying is a dialogue with doubt. The canon merely speaks in a dialect that contains fewer false friends. A third myth abused the word tank, in the way salesmen abuse the word free, because the bore was large and the explosions satisfying. Men love to tell stories about armored beasts humbled by a fighter's nose. A ledger tears such stories into smaller, truer pieces. Armor defeats hope with the monotony of physics. The Airacobra's weapon was built to collapse wings, to open radiators, to persuade engines to swallow fire. It did its duty with grace. It never promised to be a field gun that had learned to fly. There was, finally, a myth that flattered defeat as if it were insight, that because the airplane fought low and asked for maintenance with a schoolmaster's austerity, it must have been a poor idea from the start. This is the myth that keeps committees employed and nations safe from excellence. The truth it trembles before is simpler, and therefore unfashionable. A machine can be exactly right for a fight that is not yours, and meeting it can make you better even if you never build its twin. It can teach you to recognize the shape of your own doctrine and the lazy corners where compromise has been hiding. Men who keep truths instead of myths do not speak as loudly. You hear them in hangars in the hour when light turns honey-colored and tools return to drawers. They say, "Keep your feed lips slick." They say, "Wait until the picture is what the sight was drawn for." They say, "Recoil that comes home straight will spare your corrections for the thinking, not the wrestling." None of it is poetry until the morning it saves a life, and then it is. The cannon lay on its rails one last time beneath the swing of a lamp that had outlived 3 supervisors and 2 wars. The shop was quieter than men prefer to remember it. Endings are always softer than legends promise. The engineer who had first tapped the spinner months ago and said the word that changed the room stood with a rag over his shoulder and the posture of a man content to let silence do most of the talking. He pulled the breech back and let it run forward twice, not because it needed it, but because hands like to close circles. He traced the mouth where the drum kisses the feed, felt the smoothness that had been argued into existence by 100 small acts of attention, and smiled at the memory of the day when a stoppage had taught the lab humility better than any memo. He tightened a screw that did not need tightening and loosened it back to where it had lived all spring, so that the threads could remember home. Ritual is not superstition when it keeps faith. It is gratitude expressed in mechanics. On a nearby bench lay the documents that machines never read but always deserve. They were not immaculate. Oil had left fingerprints like signatures from ghosts. Pencil margins carried hesitations that had turned into corrections and then into doctrine. If an archaeologist from another age had opened that folder, he would have learned that clarity has a smell, lacquer, and solvent and paper warmed by hands, and that certain lines of prose carry the weight of action because they were earned by men who were not impressed by adjectives. He shut the folder and looked at the gun and let memory do its brisk inventory. A wreck in a jungle. A haul down a road where roots tried to steal everything not tied twice. A first firing that sounded like a door knocking on a house you didn't know you had inherited. Pilots who learned to wait. Crew chiefs who learned to polish. Boards that learned to sign for trials instead of theories. Myths that learned to shrink into trinkets. And truths that learned to stand upright without drama. He had met many machines that arrived with noise and left with excuses. This one had arrived with questions and left with habits. Outside, rain began with the directness of a confession. The engineer wiped the barrel and draped canvas over the mount and turned the lamp off. He did not indulge in a valedictory speech because machines do not require an audience to be honored. He only put his palm flat on the canvas, where the muzzle rested and felt through cloth, the stubborn straightness underneath. There is a kind of respect that contains no envy and no desire to own. It is the respect of a craftsman for an idea made honest. In time, the wrecked airframe would rust itself back into the soil that had tried to claim it the day men first cut it free. In time, the cannon would be shelved, then displayed, then perhaps forgotten until someone's child asked why an airplane would ever carry a gun in its nose. A patient father would answer that the designers had believed in ending arguments quickly, that they had trusted a pilot who could wait a half breath, and that they had been willing to build an entire airplane around a principle when others were content to staple principles onto airplanes as decorations. Before he locked the door, the engineer wrote one more line in a notebook that had a dozen blank pages left and would probably outlive him. It said, "Design is doctrine made metal." He had written it once, long ago, when the spinner still smelled like salt and the jungle still clung to every thread of wiring. He wrote it again now, because repetition is how you teach a lesson to the future. Then he put the pencil behind his ear, stepped into the rain, and let the door swing shut on the last inspection.